Welcome to another episode of Arab Identity presented to you by the Arab American Center for Culture and Arts. This is your host, Wissam Charafeddine. In our first episode, we discussed the definition of Arab identity. We said that an Arab is defined as a person who descends from an Arabic tribe, or a person who speaks Arabic language as his first language, or a person who politically belongs to one of the Arab countries that are part of the Arab League, or, and most importantly, a person who identifies as an Arab culturally, even if he doesn't speak Arabic, even if his ancestry is lost or there is no direct connection to an Arab tribe, and even if he does not live in the Arab world. So it's a cultural definition that transcends borders and transcends race. And in the second episode, we spoke about the Arab identity before Islam, an identity that had been kind of overridden or marginalized by the great triumph of Islam and the rich culture that has bestowed on the Arab culture, that there was a sort of forgetting or undermining of the Arab history and culture before it, that is was worth mentioning and revising, for it had a lot of points of strength and great features that are still a part of our Arab identity. Today, we will be speaking about the Arab identity within the Ottoman dynasty, coming along with these episodes to re-examining our Arab identity today. So we jumped really fast through centuries to reach to the Ottoman Empire, because we are going to focus on the rebirth of the political Arab identity, which happened in the earlier 20th century, and the Arab awakening that happened in the late 19th century. So we'll be focusing on this era, and then we will be taking from there on a lot of focus on the modern Arab identity. So a brief history before we bring in our honored guests. The relations between Turks and Arabs go back centuries. Muslim Arabs began to conquer Turkic regions starting at about 705 after Christ, and Turks fought on the side of the Arabs against the Chinese in the Battle of Talas in 751. This alliance developed a connection between Turks and Arabs. Turkic princes in Turkestan adopted Islam, and later the people adopted Islam en masse. Abbasids formed military units comprised of Turks and established cities like Samarra, where these units settled. Abbasids had a reaction against the Umayyad dynasty, which kind of had an Arab favoritism, and it favored Arabs over other Muslims. And the Abbasids had a reaction against that, and they have revolted against Umayyads with that pretext, with the support and help of a lot of ethnicities, among which were Turks and Persians. And after the Abbasids have settled their, and they basically took the reins of the dynasty and the start of the Abbasid dynasty, there were a lot of power given to all kinds of ethnicities, especially the Turks and the Persians. Due to their advanced war skills, Turks moved to high positions in the army. They were also assigned to state positions. Indeed, this practice helped them warm up to Islam, and all Turks adopted Islam by the 10th century. Upon the Shia invasion of Baghdad in the 11th century, the Abbasid Khalifa asked for the help of the Seljuk Sultan, Tughrul Bey. The Sultan went to Baghdad and saved the Khalifa from the Safavid attack and married the Khalifa's daughter. Turks gained a place in history as the new leader of the Muslims. The Seljuk Empire conquered grew and conquered all Arab regions except North Africa. That's what's called the Second Abbasid dynasty. The Second Abbasid age, the Abbasid Khilafah shrunk down, and there were a lot of different dynasties that arose and changed in size, and none of which were ruled by Arabs except the Fatimid dynasty. The Seljuk dynasty was ruled by the Turks, and it was one of the most powerful dynasties. They ruled basically all the Arab regions except North Africa. And the Seljuk Empire continued. It and the Mamluk dynasty were the two largest until the Ottomans started gaining power, appearing and spreading in the regions that used to be the Seljuk and Mamluk regions. Eventually, Egypt and Arabic regions were ruled by Turkey again. The Ottomans, as heir to the Seljuk Empire, began to conquer Arab territories from 1510. Sultan Selim I, the ninth Ottoman Sultan, took Syria, Egypt, and Yemen. In the same century, Iraq and North Africa came under the domination of the Ottomans. The Sultanate gained considerable prestige in the Islamic world. Other Muslim societies felt gratitude toward the Ottomans for their services to Islam. That was a sentiment for at that time when a strong dynasty takes over and organizes the matters of the nation and also defends it from other attacks. That's in the beginning of the Ottoman Empire, the birth of the Ottoman Empire within the Islamic world. The Ottomans also, in the beginning, paid esteem to Arabs as they came from Prophet Muhammad's tribe and spoke Quran's language. They called the Arabs Qam Najib al-Arab, the noble Arab tribe. The Ottomans recognized Arabs as brothers in religion. Beyond any citizenship, they accepted the Arab territories also not as colonies but as their homeland. That was a sentiment in the beginning and the birth of the Ottoman Empire. But this relationship became problematic as time progressed once it took a more colonial shape, which we will talk more about in the episode. Arabs lived in general under the Ottoman rule for 4 centuries. In the beginning, it was mostly peaceful, but as time progressed, the situation became more dire, and the Ottoman Empire started using suppressive tactics and using Arabs as fuel for basically the wars that they were starting, especially in the Eastern Europe and the Balkans area. When the young Turks grabbed power, non-Turkish communities in Ottoman society got worried. Taking advantage of the situation, imperialist powers also triggered and encouraged nationalist sentiments in the public. The Party of Union and Progress, the CUP, that is the Young Turks organization, that was a Turkish supremacist organization. When it started, it claimed that it wants to create a more modern nation, but actually turned into a more fascist Turkish organization. Once they took power, they prohibited speaking and writing in Arabic. They suppressed the Arab language and culture severely. They suppressed any political movement. They forced Arab children to study at Turkish schools, and that negative practices strained the relationship between Turks and Arabs. During World War I, the governor of Syria, Kemal Pasha, who is called in the Arab word Kemal Pasha the Butcher, who was a member of the CUP, executed Arab nationalists in Lebanon and Syria, whether they were guilty or not for their previous nationalist activities or any doubt of their nationalist movements. Although there was a general amnesty, he ignored that amnesty. Upon these incidences, the Arab relationship was strained to the point of revolution. And given the circumstances of the First World War, the Arabs found some support from the British in terms of money and weapons to mobilize their revolution. Of course, the British motive was fighting the Turks, which was part of the axis of with Germany. But that motive progressed to become more of a colonial motive itself, and ended with the Treaty of Sykes-Picot, the secret treaty that divided the Arab world among the colonial powers of France and Britain. The CUP considered that the rebellion is outrageous, and they sent troops to the regions, and there was a point of no return. When the war was over, the promise given to the Sharif was not kept, and he was exiled to Cyprus, and the Syria was given to France. Zionism was given a green light to do whatever they want in Palestine, and Iraq basically they settled with King Faisal as its king, and one of Sharif's sons, and another son, King Abdullah, became also the king of Jordan. Hijaz were given to Abdulaziz ibn Saud, the newest ally to the British. Hence, all Arab towns in the region became the colonies of the British and the French, or their basically puppets or a mandated government. When these countries withdrew from the region following World War II, they left socialist dictators or needy and powerless statelets, which depended on them and had to suppress its people. So we are living today a direct result and effect of this strained relationship, which led to the revolution, which led to the fall of the Ottoman Empire, which led to colonialism, and which led to our situation today. Thus, we're studying history to re-examine this identity in the light of all these circumstances that have made it, and to also redefine it in a way that can be inspiring to us, and it can redefine our narrative and refocus our future to a better future, especially in the Arab world. How can we bring about a change in the Arab world? And that change starts with redefining who we are and what we ought to be. I will stop at this point the summary of the incidences and the general situation of the Arabs within the Ottoman Empire. Really, to bring the guests, I don't want to take. I felt I took about 15 minutes. We have today. I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Tareq Ramadan, who's an interdisciplinary professor of anthropology and Near Eastern studies, and regularly teaches courses in the Middle East, Arab and Islamic history, society, politics, and culture at Wayne State University and Henry Ford College. And also Imam Dr. Ahmad Salih, who is also an Islamic leader, an Islamic professor, a founder of Islamic studies at Detroit Mercy, and he also has a degree in business leadership and various amounts of degrees. He's a very strong academic personality, in addition to him being also an Islamic scholar who has contributed many times to our programs, and we also have the pleasure of having him on board. Welcome, Dr. Imam Ahmad and Dr. Tareq.
Thank you.
We also will have later on Dr. Professor Hani Bawardi, the professor of history at the University of Michigan, Dearborn, who will also join us for an interjection later. He's in a class right now. So to start up the conversation, maybe we'll start with Imam. The relationship between or the Arab identity within the Ottoman rule, it has always been a point of question, and a question that has also been politicized. And today we have not moved far from this politicization. Actually, there is a renewal of the politicization of this question due to efforts of resurrect Ottomanism in the Middle East, with a leading Turkish role in the region. And also there is a resistance. The resistance to this also brings about that history again, saying that we accept Turkey as a friend, but we do not want to repeat the history of the Ottoman rule. How do you see that relationship, and how do we resolve it today?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Ahmadullah wa nasalli ala Rasul al-Kareem. Amma ba'd. I just want to make a few brief comments and then move on. To me, the Ottoman period really ended with Abdul Hamid. And that is maybe by the time they dethroned him. And Abdul Hamid, of course, ruled for 33 years, and to me, he was a very pious ruler. And the British and all the colonial actors, they started way in the 15th century. I mean, the Dutch took over the Malay world in 1511, and they just kept on interfering relentlessly. And one can actually see on the whole story of the Payitaht, Abdul Hamid, how it's just without stop, and he never ever has a rest. So I'm coming in as like an Arabophile, and I really love your definition of who's Arabic. I just know pure Arabic, of course, Fusha. And our teachers used to teach us that anyone who doesn't speak Fusha, laysu bi'arabin khullas. So we have that type of, just that passion for Arabic. And we grew up in a society that even if you cough in Arabic, then you must be exalted and you must be great. So that is a type of society. But then also, I think Abdul Hamid sent some of his teachers, some of the top, almost Shuyukh al-Islam, to settle in our community in Cape Town, South Africa. So that gives us a little Turkish blood, in Ottoman blood, I would say, and I'd make a distinction. To me, Kemal Atatürk was a destroyer of Islam. And he didn't just destroy Arab Islam, he destroyed Turkish, wherever he had power. So I have absolutely no sympathy for him or for what he has done and the type of destruction and putting an end to the Adhan and getting rid of the Arabic script. And to me, that's a tragedy, that's very sad. But if I compare also what's happening today, and I'm thinking especially of that menace that we have in the Middle East, Israel, I think the one of the credits that we do have to give to the Ottomans, especially with Abdul Hamid, is making sure that the Zionists do not take a foothold in Palestine. They do not buy out Jerusalem. But unfortunately, the Young Turks were collaborating with the Zionists. They were collaborating with the British and everyone in order to get where they eventually were. So they were constantly spies from the British in Aqaba and in Iraq and everywhere, and they constantly tried to buy out and create a lot of instability and internal chaos within the Ottoman establishment. So I think comparing the scale and the scope of destruction, especially I think when we stop with before the dethronement of Abdul Hamid, and looking at some of the other contributions the Ottomans also made, I'm thinking of the time when Sultan Abdulaziz, for instance, sent a fleet to go and rescue 150,000 Jews and went to fight out there. Or maybe what some of the Ottomans did with the Tanzimat reforms. In fact, today the whole issue of homosexuality is something modern, and yet in 1850s already they decriminalized homosexuality. Now, there's a lot of things that they adopted from the Mongols who then embraced Islam, and it's things that we can really find very problematic, where a new sultan comes in and he kills many of the family members in order to keep them out of the rule. Sultan Ahmad killed 18 family members. Now, those are clearly some of the bad customs that they adopted sometimes from the Mongols that married into them or became also part of them. And then also sometimes getting the children of the Arab chiefs to forcing them to study in the capital. But I think if I have to compare the devastation of the Israelis and the British and the French and the Italians and the Germans and all of them collectively, and the massive slaughter of millions of Arabs and Muslims in particular, then I think then these Ottomans sometimes appear to be saints, comparatively speaking. So I think that is where I'm coming from. I'm looking especially at some of these Ottomans that really had a type of tasamuh. They were ruling over 72 different nations. The Kurds were all together. Perhaps they didn't have the divide and rule that we had with the British, that would slice up the Kurd into 4 different nations or split up wherever they could split up communities. The Ottomans tried to help out the Muslims of the South Indian continent, the Muslims of the Malay world. They just tried everything, sent emissaries as far as Mozambique, Mozambique or Bek, and right into South Africa. So I think if we really want to, and you speak beautifully about transcending things, looking at the past, some of those great things, even with the Seljuks in the 1100s, taking care of Al-Ghazali and many of the great scholars against the Baltinis of Alamut and so on. To me, the scale of destruction and murder and almost satanic eugenesis that comes from the Israeli camp, and most of the last 50 years, also the destruction came from them. I think that is just pales in comparison what the Ottomans have done, and I'm excluding the Young Turks, of course. So just one last point, and I want to give our fellow panelists also enough time to, and I'm also here to learn, of course. The Fatimids, of course, were of course, from a different Shia sect, and they had 1 or 2 of their caliphs, like Hakim, that was just crazy, and he hurt everyone, whether it's Muslim or everyone alike. And it was wonderful that the Kurdish ruler like Salahuddin would take over then, and then they ushered in a different rule of tolerance and learning, etc. So maybe we just, sometimes have to jump from place to place. But I think it's good that we also recognize how sometimes brutal the Umayyads were, what they did to Imam Hussein and his family at Karbala, and how the Abbasids then, how they had slaughtered almost every member of the Umayyads except the one who fled to Spain and found the Umayyads out there. But Islam does need an enlightened leader, and I'm not sure how we're going to get that back in order to avoid whatever is happening now. Look at the assassination in Iran recently with a squad of 62 people. Azerbaijan has been taken over mostly by Israeli drones, and now they have a foothold in order to be closer to the nuclear reactors of Iran. They're really going onto the war path. Lastly, I want to mention a very important book, and that is written by a professor in Australia, Jewish professor Gideon Polya. And he actually looks at, since the 1950s till now, for the past 70 years, and he actually put the death toll, the unnecessary death toll of Arabs and Muslims at almost 500 million. Now you look at that amount, the number, and you look at the 6 million of the Holocaust, and yet we are told that the Holocaust is the ultimate pain and the ultimate tragedy. And so I think it's important to look at the multiple Holocausts, the multiple genocides that took place, and especially at the hands of the colonial powers, and what the French have done in North Africa, that have been Arabicized. It's important to look comparatively at the scale and the scope of destruction. They don't care about masajid, they don't care about Hufaz, they don't care about ulama and Islamic learning. The destruction was just enormous.
Thank you, Imam. I love how you expanded the subject, proving the point that everything is connected at the end.
Yeah.
But we will try to, focus a little bit on the subject at hand, and then maybe tackle some of these results. The same question goes to you, Dr. Tareq. Your take on this discussion.
Well, I think by virtue of the very political dynamic that existed between the Arabs and the Turks, now the Arabs were subjected to Turkish political dominion and authority, by the 10th century or early 11th century or so. And so the Arabs became subjects of the Turks. And of course, as in regards to that particular relationship, it undoubtedly affected the sort of existing exchange between the two peoples, right? The Arabs went from being a people who at least had dominated, right, much of North Africa, the Central Arab lands of the Middle East, right, and then also parts of Central Asia and Iran. And then all of a sudden, actually quite gradually, they lost power out to the Buyids, and then of course to the Seljuks, and so the Arabs became subjects. And from the time that the Arabs came under Ottoman rule in 1517, the sort of position, at least, or the identity of the Arabs became intimately connected to that of their Ottoman overlords. Now, fast forwarding to the early 20th century, we begin to see the disparate Arab peoples responding to the emergence of nationalist sentiments that were sort of being exported from Europe in different ways, in different manners. It's important to contextualize what was happening also in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Europe began to see an increasing sort of widespread collective political sentiment that was predicated upon this kind of infatuation with identity being intimately linked to a geopolitical space, a nation state. And of course, that idea was very influential in the way that, in particular, well, not just minority groups, but many different ethno-religious communities in the Ottoman state also, they began to see themselves in very different ways. You had the emergence of, for example, Zionism. You had the sort of initial beginnings of Arabism. You had, an increased sort of sense of territorial cognizance, right? A particular sort of strand of pseudo-nationalism that was really sort of rooted in this idea of attachment to a place amongst a community that has a shared collective historical memory. And so Arab identity and Arab nationalism really comes in many different strands. We can't speak about a singular monolithic sort of collective Arab identity at the start of the 20th century. The disparate Arab peoples of the Ottoman state, which covered a wide geographic expanse, contained many different flavors of Arab identity and different expressions of Arabism. Few groups prior to the war were calling, at least Arab groups, were calling for the creation of an independent Arab homeland that was completely detached from the Ottoman state. That wasn't the prevailing sentiment. A few years into the war, we begin to see that there are some groups who begin to view their future political kind of position, in secessionist terms, as separatists. But there were many groups, for example, that were all vying for some semblance of nationhood, be they Zionists, Armenians, Arabs, or other groups in the Ottoman realm. Now, it is certainly true that Arabism took on a number of different kinds of expressions, and those expressions were facilitated by the spread of things like print journalism, which made Arab groups more capable of disseminating their particular ideology and their disposition in relation to the Ottoman realm, which was transforming and transitioning very, very rapidly. You had the end of the Hamidian period, right? Then you have the rise of the Young Turks and the revolution. In 1909, then you have the emergence of the CUP, which begins to transform the very nature of the Ottoman state. Now, some argue that the Ottoman state wasn't Turkifying, and there's a debate about that. Was there a violent Turkification of the Ottoman state that was happening? Some might argue certainly there was, right? And I think there's plenty of evidence to suggest that that was also part of the case. Also, you had what some might regard as a centralization. As the empire was beginning to, shrink, the Ottoman Turks sought a way of maintaining the existing provinces, especially after the Balkan Wars left much of Southeastern Europe out of reach of the Ottomans. And at the same time, you see groups that were forming, mostly secret societies, in Paris and Istanbul, like Al-Fatat, Al-Qahtaniya, Al-Ahad, the Decentralization Party in Egypt, for example, all of whom were really calling for some measure of Arab autonomy, but not necessarily calling for a complete detachment from the Ottoman realm. I think in the historical consciousness of the Arabs, there was a sense of fear, especially after Napoleon invades Egypt in 1798. It exposed the vulnerability of the Ottoman state. I think from that point on, I think there's a measure of maybe diplomacy and pragmatism that is foundational to Arabism. I think many Arabs understood that the Ottoman state did provide a measure of protection from the encroachment of the European powers. Now, again, Arabism took on many forms. It's hard to detach some forms from a sort of growing Islamism that we also kind of see emerging in parts of Arabia and in the Middle East, in the Central Arab lands at the same time. I mean, Abdul Hamid even tried to utilize his credentials as the caliph, right, to essentially garner the support of Muslims around the world. When more than 3/4 of the world's Muslims were under some form of, European occupation. And I think that Islam became a vehicle for some leaders like Abdul Hamid and even later on Sharif Hussein to use as a rallying cry to bring attention to the Arab cause and the championing of Arab resistance against the Ottoman Turks, whom they saw as this increasingly brutal, Turkifying, hyper-nationalistic movement that sought to sort of, expel and purge the Arabs from the Ottoman state. Now, I think that we began to see various kinds of Arab nationalist expressions, some more proto-nationalistic. For example, you had, in 1911, you had, for example, the publication of the newspaper Palestine, right, by the Isa cousins in Jaffa in Palestine. And that newspaper served in many ways as a vocalization of an Arab Palestinian sort of emergent nationalism that tied historical memory to place. And so we have the convening of secret societies, again in the Middle East. Multiple organizations have invested in outreach to the Arab populations of Syria, Palestine, Bilad al-Sham. And so you have multiple, and again, you have multiple ways in which Arabism is articulated. Many, for example, Lebanese Maronite Christians wanted to de-emphasize the role of Islam in framing the parameters of Arab nationalist discourse, while others saw Islam as a primary sort of component of Islamism, because in the minds of many, it's hard to detach Islamic history, right? Achievements of Muslims, the Arabic language, and the universalization of Arabic as a liturgical language around the world from Arabism. So you had competing sorts of ideas about what Arabism and Arab identity constituted. There was not a singular monolithic narrow strand of Arabism that was being vocalized among these secret societies, whom Jamal Pasha ultimately found out about in the middle of the war. and instituted measures that you talked about early on in the program. By 1916 in May, he rounded up, dozens of Arab nationalists, accusing them of treachery and of being traitors, and hanged them in Beirut and in Damascus, as a way to suppress this manifestation of this non-Turkish Arab expression of identity.
Yes, Doctor, the Arabs never really objected to the Ottoman rule. They actually they were part of the Ottoman Empire, and they reckoned themselves as Ottomans. They've never objected to the Ottoman rule for the sake of just expressing national identity, or for the sake of separationism, or any that sort of thing.
Yes, I'm sorry, can I interject for a second?
Sure.
You're absolutely right. These early secret societies were not calling for, they were not separatists or secessionists. They actually saw the Ottomans as a legitimate political actor whom they found protection in from encroaching in European powers. Right. And so they were not calling, like you said, they were not calling for separatism. They were calling for autonomy. They were calling for cultural, linguistic, and political inclusion in this transformative Ottoman state. It wasn't until Tareq Hussein comes about, that we begin to see a slight, obviously a subtle change. And
they were forced. King Hussein himself, he was not part of any of these secret societies, right, nor he was sympathetic with any of them when they were born. He was not a person to question his loyalty to the Ottomans. And he was,
I'm sorry, Go ahead. Sorry.
He was the strong hand of the Ottomans in the Arabic Peninsula, or at least Hijaz. But what happened is like you said, it's something that happened gradually. So there were attempts for Arab to, they were 2/3 of the population, while they had less than 1/3 of the seats. There were no representations. There were extreme suppression. There was almost a feudal system. That brought all the way to the famous starvation that happened in the Sham and the Lebanon in 1915, 1914. So there were a lot of attempts to correct and to get more representation. There were a lot of promises by Sultan Abdul Hamid. And then when the CUP was formed, there were some Arabs members in the CUP, because it was there was some hope that this might bring some modernization and decentralization to Turkey, but it actually backfired. And it led these organizations, which were, Al-Qahtaniya and the Nadi Al-Adabi fi Istanbul. They used to be only celebrating Arab culture and Arab language, and and they were forced to evolve into political organizations, from which Al-Fatah then were born, and Al-Ahad. And these
ends up, I'm sorry.
I'm
going to interject for a moment here. So the Al-Fatah ends up endorsing Sharif Hussein later on. But certainly
Abdullah was a member of it, and then Faisal became a member.
His sons were. Yeah.
And the Arab organizations merged into the only solution of national manifestation.
Sure.
And Dr. Ali Alawi, in his book Faisal I, he narrates in details that some of the British documentation that proves that King Faisal, during 1916, 1917, during the last stages of war with the Turks, there were secret, after the revelation, in about 1917, the Psychis Biko started to be revealed. And it wasn't, because the British were denying it, and there were a lot of doubts about it. But it was very strong rumors and very strong news that shocked the Arabs, and the Turks were also using it to deter Arabs from the revolution. There were secret negotiations between Malik Faisal and Kemal Pasha to actually come back to the Ottoman realm. and there were conditions just to be recognized as, let the Arab officers serve in Arab places and let us have our language, etc. And there were rejection from Kemal Pasha for these conditions. We wish that we were more tolerant as Ottomans to keep us together, but unfortunately, and this happens, again and again, is that this kind of intolerance and fascism in our rule breaks us apart. I'll leave you for commenting. I want to bring a comment here by Professor On Jaber, who says there is no difference between Abdul Hamid's policy back then and Erdogan's policy now toward Palestine. They both gave in to the interest of Zionists regarding Palestine. I feel the subject of the relationship between Zionism and the Ottomans and Zionism and the Arab Revolution needs an episode by itself, because there's a lot of intricacies towards it. The impression of the Islamic world and the Arab world about Zionism was different then than it today. There were actually sympathy more than caution. And they allowed the immigration of Jews to Palestine. They never knew that it will manifest into political ambition to a separate state. So yeah, we will have a lot of more talk about this in a separate episode too.
I mean, yeah.
Yes, tfadal, Doctor, and then we'll go back to Imam Salih.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. It's okay. You can.
Yeah, no, yeah. I just think, and I'd say, coming back again as both an Arabophile and Turcophile and Islamophile for that matter, looking back at the life of Abdul Hamid, I think it was in the interest of these colonial powers to really distort the narrative. And so I'm wondering where, which narratives we really have, because to the best of my knowledge, much of the terror gangs from the Zionists started after the dethronement of Abdul Hamid. So I think he did try his level best to and he saw the danger of Zionism, and it's actually seen throughout that show of the Payitah Abdul Hamid. So that to me is one of the great things. Also, there is love for Islam, a love for the Quran, and when the Prophet is mentioned, they would put their hands on their heart, and because I think the Ottomans were Sufis also, they were much closer to the Shia, and the moment the British started to promote the Wahhabi state, you had another dynamic or emerging out there through the Wahhabis, extreme Wahhabis creating havoc throughout the Muslim world, and many of them had more Sufi sympathies, which made them a little closer to the Shia. Sometimes political noises coming from the rulers and how the people were actually living together. With many of us grew up never even knowing what's the difference between Shia and Sunni. But then the other question is, do we really have pure Arabs and pure Turks? Because if we speak your history about Tugrul Beg marrying the daughter of the Khalif, at that point, are we speaking now of Arabo-Turks or a mixture? Wherever the Arabs went, and I think it's part of the genius of the Arabs, where the Arabs would go to East Africa, the African coast, and marrying into the people and creating a unique community of the Sahili or the Swahili people that expanded right into the Congo and right down to almost South Africa. So I think that makes it a little, and you look at the Ottomans sending their daughters and princesses into the European courts, marrying into India, marrying into the Malay world. That's why the Malay world, which includes the Philippines and Indonesia, see themselves as very much Ottoman Malay, And so I would like to actually, that to me is very unique, because we almost seem to give the impression that the Arabs stayed as a pure Arab community within their clusters, and none of this type of symbiosis or that really took place. One could really then expand also on that definition.
Right.
But I would like to just reiterate, I think the colonial powers they were extremely devious. They were extremely conniving. They never ever stopped, as if Shaitan was working 24/7, 365 days for a few hundred years. So that is also very important, never to underestimate that damage they constantly committed. But we really need, someone said about Abdul Hamid, and that was the Kaiser of Germany, and he said that out of all the intellect being given to all the leaders of his time, Abdul Hamid had 95%. Wilhelm, he said, I have 4%, and the rest of all the leaders have 1%. So how Abdul Hamid could use his secrets that he had of the British court, of the French courts, of the Russian courts, and how he could really stop them from a lot of damage that could have happened much earlier on.
Yes. Thank you, Imam. Dr. Tareq, for your comments, before you comment, just want to mention that we are growing tired of always comparing who's the the worst, what do you call it, the lesser of two evils.
Yeah.
We Sultan Abdul Hamid, although he was more of a person, more diplomatic and more understanding perhaps, and he had a good relationship with Sharif Hussein, and sometimes he would settle issues by compromising some things, but at the end of the day, the rule that he was on top of was brutal.
It's true.
And we recognize his good qualities, but at the end of the day, we still went backwards over the total and the total outcome. It's true that they have defended some regions and areas from colonialism, but also they let go of some regions, and the Portuguese, they played left and right, and then Morocco was lost very early on, and Morocco was under the Turkish rule when it was lost to the French, and some areas are still under the French occupation till now. And then Tunisia and Libya went to Italy, and then Egypt. And Egypt remained for a very long time, that almost separated its narrative from the rest of the Arab world. Like Tareq said, there's different manifestations of Arabism. It is also because of colonialism and that separationism. But they prevented, for example, the printing press, and they brought back the Arab culture to backwards for centuries. We had to rely on the French press that allowed us to print in Arabic in Egypt and created the Arab awakening, and then the missionaries in Lebanon who brought the printing press to print a Bible basically in Arabic, but it created also an Arab awakening in Lebanon. Why do we have to wait for that to create a cultural awakening? So it is really sad that we have to compare colonialism with the Ottomans, and which have done more damage. As far as massacres, it's true that we have to recognize every people who suffered and every dictator who made them suffer, including the devastation that Muslims are going through today in China, and the overwhelming also Islamophobia in Europe. But also we have to recognize the massacres that the Ottomans did to the Arabs. I think they are no less than the massacres done to the Armenians, or other massacres that people want to recognize. So there were a lot of massacres done in the name of the Ottomans in Arab nations. Dr. Tareq.
So I want to actually respond to your first point about Abdul Hamid and the way that he's been characterized. Abdul Hamid is a convoluted, very complex individual, historical figure, right? I mean, he ends the first constitutional sort of era in Ottoman history. He engages in brutal campaigns of assault, right, against the Armenians in the 1890s. He constructs the Hejaz Railway, which can be used to help, fortify and garrison the Hejaz, because you can expedite the movement of pilgrims going to the Hajj, but you can also, expedite, the troop movements of the Ottoman soldiery into the Hejaz in an area that was already resistant. Many of the tribes of Arabia were already resistant to the Ottoman state and wanted to detach from it anyways. And the Arabs of the interior of Arabia, they were essentially never brought under the Ottoman control. They resisted, and they were not able to penetrate the interiors of the Arabian Peninsula. But in some ways, Abd al-Hamid was a pragmatist, maybe a diplomat in some capacity. He was also brutal and tyrannical as well. He became increasingly paranoid by the beginning of the 20th century, right? Until he was deposed and he was removed from power. Many of the Young Turks and CUP figures that emerge, that emerge, and those, for example, who take over the Ottoman state under the triumvirate under Jamal, Anwar, and Talat Pasha, were products of some of the policies that he made, right? I mean, he ended up using the telegraph to spy on his local administrators, right, whom he exiled. So much of the intelligentsia and even civil servants, right, were exiled into Europe. And in Europe, Southeastern Europe, is when we began to see the sort of the emergence of the Young Turks, and then of course the CUP. Jamal Pasha, on the other hand, was head of the Ottoman Fourth, Army, who became the governor of Syria and was known, like you said, as Al-Safah, right, the bloodthirsty. He ended up acquiring all kinds of documents about the Arab secret societies, which he took from the French consulate, which the French were actually documenting all of the secret societies, some of whom were based in Paris, others who were based in Lebanon and Syria. And so they had a treasure trove of documents about the inner workings and secrecy, the secret components of these secret societies, right? They used special coded language to communicate with each other. And so he was able to acquire that. He also was able to acquire information from actual members of these groups, which he then used to suppress them and to launch campaigns of assault against these Arab nationalists. And he ends up writing his own book about these secret organizations. And after he sort of engages in these brutal and violent and bloody campaigns against Arab nationalists in 1916. So Jamal was somebody who wanted complete dominion and authority over the Ottoman Arab central states of Syria, Palestine, and was obviously and clearly brutal. The documentary record is very clear about that. There are pictures of Arab nationalists being hanged, in Damascus and Beirut under his rule. The other thing I wanted to mention too was that much of the early Arab nationalist, many of the early Arab nationalist movements were launched by, or at least facilitated by Christian thinkers, the Christian intelligentsia in Jabal Lebanon, Mount Lebanon, right, in modern day Lebanon. So, and part of that was because it was a way in which to, obviously, Christians were part of the millet system, and Christians, be they Arabs or otherwise, right, were granted secondary status under Ottoman law, right? And one way, obviously, to respond to that, or to even circumvent that, is by potentially creating an alternative, right, to the Ottoman political Turkifying structure, in hopes that the Arabs could launch a secular nationalist counterweight to the Ottomans, right, that was devoid of Islam and an Islamic lexicon, right? And so many of the early Christians, again, want to de-emphasize the role of Islam in Arabism, but it was done so as a strategic measure, in hopes that it could actually create a broad resistance to the Ottomans, in hopes that the Arabs could ultimately acquire a greater measure of autonomy and sovereignty and independence in their own lands.
Thank you, Doctor.
Sure, you're welcome.
Imam, any comments?
Yeah, I'm actually very not so clued up on modern Arabic history, and to me, a lot of the history I never. When it came to Kemal Ataturk, you started to destroy Islam, and that was just for many years my opinion about that. But I think I've come to, and I think if we have to look at the history of the Turks, as you say, going back to 705, and look at all through and just put together, and instead of just zooming in on the CPU and their bloodthirstiness and also that that connection they had with the French and with all these other people, it just creates a lot of what I'm not sure if the word is obfuscation or confusion out there. To me, I would like to look at some of the Ottomans and look at some of their achievements, whether it's some of the, the tasamuq, the fact that they had 8 different legal systems. And in many countries, even in our own country, we don't have more than one legal system. And those legal systems often involve different religious communities. And how many of those Jewish people could rise up to the rank and become even the Grand Wazir. So that is a part of the Ottoman history that I would like to see. We just acknowledge that, and of course we cannot ignore the brutalities. Whenever there were brutalities, we need to expose that. But I think the scope and the scale of destruction of the Muslim world and the Arab world, with the colonial powers coming in and the colonial powers having been behind the scene all along, I think there's no type of equal opportunity crime. 50-50, that was brutal, that was brutal. It just doesn't compare. So I'd like to see people look at that. And then I'm also, of course, constantly thinking of how we're going to overcome where we are in now, the situation, the quagmire we find ourselves in. Do we have to wait for Imam Mahdi? Do we have to wait for Nabi Isa alayhi salam? Because every time an Arab Muslim, every time a Turkish Muslim or a Muslim in China or anywhere, they pain the pain. We all feel that particular pain, the Rohingyas and so on. Coming back to that book again by Gideon Polya, and Gideon Polya would connect Zionism is not only connected to Palestine. Zionism is global, and the terror is also global, and he connects them to the Rohingya. Of course, Modi in India right now. Zionism has got its tentacles everywhere. We just wish some other great Ottomans could have come afterwards, and maybe Ottomans married to Arabs and could have stopped this type of devastation that we see today.
It's not really about race, so it's not.
Yeah,
we are not really concerned about race over here. So the purpose of this program in general is really in defense of an identity that's being crushed, and it's the attack on it is translated into actually defeated people, defeated governments that are using the defeatism of their people to continue their rule. The over separation between Arab wars and the tension that is created between Arab countries that are delusional. Also, they use basically the attack and the minimalization and marginalization of the Arab identity to do that. So they don't want the Arab identity is under attack. For the Arab identity is a danger for a lot of the projects that are taking place in the Middle East. And that's why we are here in defense of Arab identity as a cultural identity and not as a racial identity. We do not see any race superior on any other race. As a Muslim, لا فضل على عربي على عجمي إلا بالتقوى. We have come to a conclusion of our time, but we will leave a few words, Dr. Tareq, before we conclude our program.
Oh, yeah. Thank you, Wissam. So, we talk about Arab identity, and I think it's really important to qualify what that in fact is and what that means, because I think that even today, whether it was today or even in the past, it's always been very difficult to, with any measure of specificity, to define Arab identity in such a way that it appeals to the masses, whether Arab identity is predicated upon language, culture. Well, there are many different linguistic orientations, right, across the Arab world. I mean, for how are you, we say shlonak, kefak. If you're in Egypt, you say ezayak. You're in the rest of the Levant, you say kefak, kif halak. And even these subtleties, right, are really markers of the different kinds of linguistic and historical trajectories, right, that shaped and molded these various kinds of Arab peoples, right? So to speak of the Arabs as a singular monolithic community that is cohesive and collective and has the same distinct sort of foundational sense of what it means to be an Arab, I think that's very difficult to do. It's hard to say with any measure of certainty who is or what is an Arab. I mean, if you go back to 853 BC, right, the first mention of the Arabs is by King Shalmaneser III. It's a plaque discussing the Assyrian battles with Syrian and Palestinian Arabs. The Arabs then were basically marginal people. I don't mean marginal economically. I mean, well, sort of. They were peoples living on the peripheries of the major urban centers, right, of the ancient empires. And so what Arab meant then was not certainly the same that, you know, it doesn't mean the same as to what Arabs sort of what it means today in the minds of most people, right? Is Arab identity predicated upon language? Well, there are many Arabs, for example, Arab Americans who don't speak Arabic, right? Who certainly see themselves as Arabs, and even nationalistic in that sort in some regards, right? Is it shared historical memory? I mean, more so, there are many different sort of vocalizations and articulations of Arab culture, right? I mean, Arab culture, for example, in some village in Morocco might be, in fact, quite distinguishable from, say, you know, Bedouin culture in southern Jordan, where I spent considerable time. And so I know that there are incredible variations, right, into what constitutes Arab culture. If it's historical memory, well, then that means that, you know, the Arabs can harken back to these important figures or texts or works or whatever it might, literature, culture, art. And maybe that is the essence of what an Arab today essentially sort of means, because outside of language or even religion, right, it's hard to, I mean, using those as measures of Arab identity is a very difficult task.
True, and that's the conclusion we came about in our first episode, that the modern definition should be a cultural one.
A cultural one, yeah.
That collective historical memory. The way that a person in Mauritania will say a poem that every single Arab will move to it from east to west. The way that a Yemeni would take a song for Kulthum and play it with a Adani tune, and the words are by a Syrian artist, and it all comes in together with this shared spirit.
Right.
So that's something that we want to hang on to, because this is what is bringing us together. And when you bring us together, the colonial projects fail. I mean, we still have countries colonized in the Middle East. At least one.
Well, I think the idea of a cohesive collective Arab identity is much more imaginative than I think we're willing to believe. I think it exists much more in the imagination than in practice, right? I mean, the Arab world has been subjected not just to colonial forces, right, which has subjugated them, but also internal conflicts, whether it be sectarianism or classism, right? Whether it be the existing kinds of, you know, political hierarchies that divided populations and between the ruling and the ruled, between the different kinds of linguistic and cultural orientations, right? All those things have in many ways shaped and or prevented the emergence of a truly unified collective people and a collective identity. Maybe the closest we have is during the Umayyad period, when they practiced the Arab exclusivism. That's the last time in which the Arabs were at least representative of a dominant political culture that was widespread from Africa to Central Asia. But
I think Abdel Nasser came close. I think Abdel Nasser came close.
He came the closest, you know.
Yeah. But I mean, given the circumstances and the challenges, you know, he came close. You know, I think he came close because I want to argue, Doctor, that the actual reality is more than our imagination and not less. It is. I feel that our imagination has been colonized and has been. We are not allowed to dream. Our dreams have been suppressed. You come to a continent like Europe with such diverse backgrounds and religions and languages and geographical barriers and a history filled with blood, millions of people killed in every battle. And then they have created the European Union in a miraculous time frame, where a European travels from Poland all the way to London with no questions asked, and then we who have no geographical boundaries, who have no historical context for these political divisions, who have a collective memory, who have one language, etc. It seems the talk of any cohesive Arab project or Arab future is almost impossible to even imagine or dream of. And I feel that is part of the defeatism that we have come towards, and that's the purpose of this program, is to really re-examine, at least to re-examine that notion. And this discussion is very important in to achieve that goal. So coming back to conclude about the colonial, the Ottomans and the Arab identity, we understand the history that the Ottoman Empire have contributed in many ways, not only to the Arabs but to the world. But in the same time, it has ended up to be a nation that has suppressed the Arab identity and forced it to seek a national separate identity, and basically gave birth or induced labor to the new modern national Arab identity, which we will talk more about in the upcoming episodes. Is there any final statements before we end? I don't want to leave if someone wants to add something.
Yeah, I think, and I'm thinking of trying a type of way to bring the communities together. If we can let people know that nationalism is a form of sectarianism, and how we could transcend our different nationalisms. Sometimes to expose is a form of opposing, and neoliberalism has been eugenic in many ways and created millions of casualties. And so I think it's how do we take those chains of the brains, as they said. But the British was extremely, how can I say, they wanted the damage to stay at least for 100 years. So we have the agreement of Lausanne in 1923 that will only materialize where the Turks can have a little more freedom to use some of their own resources. We look at what the French are still collecting 500 billion in colonial tax from many of those West African nations, and many of them are Muslim. But then there's also that statistics that lie. I think there are so many more Muslims in Europe right now, the Arab diaspora and the Muslim diaspora, and those numbers are constantly understated. In Germany, I believe there's at least 11 million, and there's 80 million Germans there. France, even though they say there's 5 million, I would at least double that. So if you look at the statistics that lie, and there's a book about that, it's important to do to look at those type of statistics and have people to constantly inspire our community to say that we can rise from the ashes, we can defeat disaster capitalism, we can this medical fascism that we are experiencing right now. Can we get rid of the MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, Mohammed bin Zayed, and the devastation they are causing in Yemen and throughout the Arab world? Somehow we have to give solutions. And sometimes I play on the word of the ayah of the Quran, وَأَنْتَ حِلٌّ بِهَذَا الْبَلَدِ, and say وَأَنْتَ حَلٌّ لِهَذَا الْبَلَدِ. So becoming the solution to whatever communities we want to serve. But optimism is always mandatory. That's how I interpret إِنَّهُ لَا يَيْأَسُ مِنْ رَوْحِ اللَّهِ إِلَّا الْقَوْمُ الْكَافِرُونَ. And these Israeli, to me, that is the modern superpower. Their arrogance sometimes will stand in the way, and they will make mistakes. And despite all their massive power, nuclear and drone and other types of powers, Allah will send the different Dawoods and Salahuddins to come to our assistance at some point.
Thank you, Imam. Dr. Tareq, any final words?
No, I just I enjoyed the conversation, and I hope that we can continue talking about these important topics. And I think that maybe even some further excavation into this particular period of history, because it's so pivotal and so necessary to understand the emergence of a modern sort of Arab nationalism. I think this particular juncture in history is so again is so important to any sort of analysis of the rise of an Arabism and Arab identity, that I think we should spend even more time talking about the period of the late 19th century to the early 20th century, and trying to really contextualize Arab expression.
Thank you, Dr. Tareq, and thank you, Imam Salih. We thank also our followers and listeners. We'd like to also remind you that the Arab American Center for Culture and Arts, who brings you this program, does not sponsor the opinions necessarily that are expressed here. The opinions expressed are only representative of the people who express them, including the host, myself. And we continue with the Arab Identity program, many episodes to come, where we're going to be dissecting a lot of the topics that we have opened today. Thank you for your following, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Thanks.
That's good.
Thanks, Wissam.
Assalamu alaikum.
Sure.